The hall was silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat, and I was already trying to find a way out of a marriage that had not even begun. My name is Vesira Thalkoren, and on that day I stood on a platform of cold grey stone, wearing the ceremonial robes of a house that no longer had the strength to protect itself. My father stood behind me, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the floor, because he could not look at what our family had been reduced to. My mother had died 3 seasons before the war ended, and I was glad she did not live to see this moment. The war had taken our ships, our territory, and our pride. Now it was taking me. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and a human walked in. He was not what I expected. I had built an image in my mind of what a conquering soldier would look like, something loud, something proud, something that would walk into our sacred hall and treat it like a trophy room. Instead, a man in a plain grey uniform walked toward me with slow, even steps, his face calm, his eyes steady. He did not look at the banners hanging from the ceiling, the ones that told the story of my family's old victories. He did not look at the guards standing along the walls with their weapons lowered in forced respect. He looked only at me, and even that look held no triumph in it. His name was Cale Renner. I had read the file twice before the ceremony, searching for something that would explain why the peace treaty required my hand specifically to be given to this one soldier out of an entire human fleet. The file told me almost nothing. Rank, sergeant, service record, classified beyond basic assignment history, decorations, withheld from civilian access. It was the emptiest personnel file I had ever seen for a man who was apparently important enough to be handed a noblewoman as a peace tribute. I remember thinking, as he stopped in front of me, that the empire I had once been proud of had fallen so far that this was our future now. Not surrender through battle, but surrender through paperwork, sealed with a marriage neither of us had asked for. The officiant read the words of the treaty aloud, the same words that had been repeated in every noble house across our shattered territory that season. Marriages of obligation, binding the defeated to the victors, meant to prevent further conflict by tying bloodlines together so that no side would dare strike the other without striking their own family as well. It was an old practice, older than our written history, revived because nothing else had stopped the war. I did not cry. I had promised myself I would not cry in front of him, whoever he turned out to be. I stood straight, my chin lifted, and I let the officiant place my hand in his. His hand was warm. That surprised me more than it should have. I do not know what I expected, something cold, something mechanical, something that matched the emptiness of his file. Instead, his grip was steady and gentle, as if he understood that I did not want to be touched at all and was trying to make it as brief and painless as possible. "I am sorry," he said quietly, so quietly that only I could hear it, "that this is how we are starting." I did not answer him. I did not trust my voice not to shake, and I refused to let this man, this soldier from a species that had beaten mine into submission, see any weakness in me. I simply nodded once, and the ceremony continued around us like a machine that could not be stopped now that it had begun. When it ended, the guests who had come, mostly distant relations and a handful of nervous nobles from neighboring houses that had also lost soldiers and territory in the war, offered their congratulations in voices that carried no real joy. It was a funeral dressed up as a wedding. I could see it in their eyes. They were relieved it was me and not them. That night, I sat alone in my chambers, the same chambers I had slept in since I was a child, and I stared at the wall where a portrait of my mother used to hang, before it was moved to make room for a formal painting commemorating the treaty. I thought about everything I had lost. My future had once included choices, a partner I would select myself, perhaps someone from a house I respected, perhaps no one at all if I decided a solitary life suited me better. Now all of that was gone, replaced by a stranger from a species I barely understood, a species that had arrived in our part of the galaxy less than 2 decades before, and had somehow, in that short time, become powerful enough to end a war that had drained 3 empires for a generation. I heard a knock at my door, soft and hesitant. When I opened it, Cale stood there, still in his uniform, though he had removed the formal jacket and wore only the simple shirt beneath it. "I am not here to intrude," he said. I only wanted to say that I understand this is difficult, and I will not make it harder than it has to be. I will take the guest wing. You do not need to see me unless you wish to. I studied him for a long moment. In our culture, a husband claiming separate quarters on the first night would have been considered an insult, a public declaration that the marriage was a sham. But I realized, looking at his face, that he was not trying to insult me. He was trying to give me something I had not expected from him: space. Why would you offer that? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. You could claim anything you wanted. I have no power to refuse you anything under the treaty. Something shifted in his expression, something that looked almost like sadness. I know what the treaty says, he answered. I also know what it does not say. It does not say I have to be someone you fear. He left before I could respond, walking down the corridor with the same even steps he had used to cross the ceremonial hall, and I stood in my doorway for a long time after he was gone, trying to understand what had just happened. I did not sleep well that night. I kept turning his words over in my mind, searching for the trick in them, the hidden motive, because everything I had been taught about humans in the years since first contact suggested that they were opportunists, quick to take advantage of any weakness. My people's histories, the ones written during the war, described humans as relentless, unpredictable, and dangerous in ways that our own war colleges struggled to model. I had absorbed those descriptions the way anyone absorbs the stories they are told about an enemy. I expected cruelty. I expected arrogance. What I received instead was quiet courtesy, and it confused me more than open hostility would have. The following morning, I rose early, as was my habit, and made my way to the eastern terrace where I usually took my meal in solitude, watching the twin suns rise over the estate's old orchard. I was surprised to find Kale already there, sitting at the far end of the long table, a cup of something steaming in front of him, looking out at the same view I always watched. "You are an early riser," I said, unable to keep the surprise from my voice. "Old habit," he replied. "Where I trained, mornings were the only quiet time we got." I suppose I never lost the taste for it. I sat down at the opposite end of the table, keeping the distance between us that felt appropriate, and one of the household staff brought my meal without a word, though I noticed her eyes flicker toward Kale with an expression I could not quite read. Curiosity, perhaps, or something closer to wariness. "You do not have to sit so far away," Kale said after a moment. "I promise I do not bite." It was such a strange thing to say, so unlike anything I expected from a man who was supposed to represent the might of an empire that had defeated mine, that I almost laughed before I caught myself. Almost. I covered it by taking a sip of my drink and looking away. "Forgive me if I do not yet trust the comfort of your company," I said. "You are, after all, a stranger given to me by a treaty I did not write and would not have signed if I had any choice in the matter." "That is fair," he said, and there was no anger in his voice, only a quiet acceptance that unsettled me. I did not choose this assignment either, if it helps to know that. I was told where to go and I went. That is how it works for soldiers like me. "Soldiers like you," I repeated. "What kind of soldier are you exactly?" Your file was almost empty. For the first time since I had met him, I saw something close to hesitation cross his face. It was brief, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but I noticed it, the way a hunter notices a flicker of movement in tall grass. "I am just a soldier who did his job," he said finally. "Nothing more interesting than that." I did not believe him, not entirely, but I let the subject drop because pressing further felt like it would accomplish nothing except making the morning more uncomfortable than it already was. We finished the meal in a silence that was not quite peaceful, but was not hostile either, a strange middle ground I had not expected to find myself occupying with the man I had been forced to marry. Over the following days, I watched him the way one watches a puzzle that refuses to resolve into a clear picture. He rose early every morning and trained alone in the courtyard before anyone else was awake, moving through exercises that looked simple, but that I suspected required a discipline I could not fully appreciate. He ate simply, refusing the more elaborate dishes my kitchen staff offered him, saying he had never developed a taste for rich food. He spoke to the household staff with a courtesy that surprised them as much as it surprised me, thanking the groundskeepers by name, helping carry supplies when he saw someone struggling, behaving in ways that no noble husband in my culture would ever have considered, let alone a man who had every right, under the treaty, to demand service rather than offer it. My father, who had retreated into a quiet grief since the war ended, one that seemed to shrink him a little more each day, watched Cale with an expression I could not decipher. One evening, as I passed his study, I heard him speaking quietly to one of his old advisors. "He is not what I feared," my father said, "but that troubles me more than if he had been." "Why is that, my lord?" the advisor asked. "Because a man who does not need to prove his strength," my father answered, "is usually the one who has the most of it." I did not understand what my father meant at the time. I would come to understand it very soon, in a way that changed everything I believed about the man I had married out of obligation, and nothing else. The days settled into a strange rhythm. I kept my distance, testing him in small ways, watching for the cruelty or arrogance I still expected to surface eventually. I made comments designed to provoke him, questioned his species, questioned his intelligence, questioned whether he even understood the culture he had married into. He absorbed every barb without flinching, without raising his voice, without ever once making me feel small for trying. It should have satisfied me, proof that he was either too simple to notice the insults or too weak to respond to them. Instead, it left me feeling strangely unsettled, as though I were throwing stones at a wall that simply did not care to fall. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks into the marriage, I found him in the estate's old training yard, the one my grandfather had built generations ago, and that had fallen into disuse after my brothers left for the war and never returned. Cale was repairing one of the old wooden supports that held up the sparring platform, his sleeves rolled up, sweat on his brow despite the mild weather. "You do not need to do that," I said, standing at the edge of the yard. "We have staff for repairs." "I like working with my hands," he said, not looking up from the beam he was fitting into place. "It helps me think." "About what?" He paused then, setting down his tools, and looked at me directly in a way he rarely did, as though weighing whether to say something honest or something safe. "About how strange it is," he said, "to be given a family I did not choose, in a place I do not fully understand, married to someone who has every reason to hate me, and to still feel like this is somewhere I could belong, if you let me." I did not have an answer for that. I turned and walked away before he could see whatever expression had crossed my face, because I was not ready to examine what it meant that his words had affected me at all. That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling of my chambers, and for the first time since the wedding, my thoughts were not consumed entirely by resentment. There was something else mixed in now, something I did not have a name for yet, a quiet curiosity about the man sleeping in the guest wing who had, without demanding anything, without raising his voice once, begun to make me question everything I thought I knew about the species that had ended my empire's war, and, in doing so, ended the life I had once imagined for myself. I did not know then how much more there was to learn about him, or how soon I would learn it, or how violently my understanding of Cale Renner would be rewritten by events that were already, unknown to me, gathering on the edge of our system, like a storm no one in my house was prepared for. The estate had never been quiet in the way it became quiet after Cale arrived, and I do not mean the absence of noise. I mean a different kind of stillness, the kind that comes when everyone around you is watching something they do not fully understand and choosing not to speak about it. It started with the guards. My house had kept a small security detail even after the war ended, mostly older veterans who had survived the fighting and returned home with injuries that kept them from active duty, but not from standing watch over a noble estate. They were proud men and women, set in their ways, and I expected them to resent a human moving into our halls as much as I did. Instead, I began to notice something different in how they behaved around him. They straightened when he passed, not out of fear, not out of the forced respect they gave to me and my father because of our titles, but out of something else entirely, something that looked almost like reverence. One evening, I asked the captain of the guard, an older man named Doran, who had lost his left arm in the war and worn a mechanical replacement ever since, why his soldiers behaved that way around a man who held no rank in our house. Doran looked at me for a long moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. "My lady, Some of us served near the human lines during the last campaigns, he said. We heard things, not official reports, just stories that traveled between units, the kind of stories soldiers tell each other in the dark when they cannot sleep. What kind of stories? I asked. Stories about a unit that held positions no one else could hold, he said. About soldiers who walked away from engagements that should have ended them. I do not know if your husband was part of that unit. I have no proof. But there is something in the way he carries himself that reminds me of the way those stories describe them, and old soldiers learn not to ignore that feeling. I dismissed it at the time as superstition, the kind of thing frightened veterans invent to explain things they cannot otherwise process after a war that broke so many of them. But the feeling did not go away. If anything, it grew stronger as the weeks passed. Cale continued his quiet routines, training alone before dawn, working with his hands around the estate, speaking gently to everyone he encountered, regardless of their station. He asked for nothing beyond what was necessary. He never raised his voice, not once, not even when one of the younger staff members accidentally damaged a piece of equipment he had spent days repairing. He simply thanked them for telling him the truth about it, and began the repair again without complaint. I began to spend more time in his company, not because my resentment had faded entirely, but because my curiosity had grown too strong to ignore. I told myself I was simply gathering information, the way any noble would study a stranger who had been placed at the center of their household. I told myself many things during those weeks that I would later realize were only partially true. One afternoon, I found him in the estate's small library, a room my family had maintained for generations, filled with texts written in our old script that predated the common trade language most species used across the sector. I expected him to be unable to read any of it. Instead, I found him seated at the long table, a book open in front of him, moving his finger slowly along the lines of text as though he were teaching himself to read them. "You are studying our language," I said, unable to hide my surprise. "I did not want to live in a home I could not understand," he said, not looking up. It seemed disrespectful to stay here without at least trying. "Most soldiers I have met from your fleet do not bother," I said. "They rely on translation devices and consider that sufficient." "I am not most soldiers," he said quietly, and there was something in the way he said it that made me pause, a weight behind the simple words that suggested more than the sentence itself contained. "What does that mean?" I asked, sitting down across from him despite myself. He closed the book gently and looked at me. "It means I have seen things that changed how I think about the difference between surviving and living," he said. "I do not want to only survive here. I would like to actually live, if that is something you would allow." I did not know how to answer him. My upbringing had prepared me for many things: court politics, diplomatic negotiations, the management of an estate through difficult times, but it had not prepared me for a husband who spoke to me with this kind of quiet honesty, especially not one whose species had defeated mine in a war that still haunted every family in our territory. "Tell me about your war," I said instead, deflecting from the moment because I did not yet trust myself to respond to his honesty with any of my own. "Tell me what you saw that changed you." Something closed in his expression then, like a door shutting gently but firmly. "Not yet," he said. "Perhaps someday. Not yet." I did not push further, though the refusal stayed with me long after our conversation ended. Another piece of the puzzle, that was Cale Renner, a man who gave everything except the one thing I most wanted to understand. The weeks continued in this way, small moments accumulating between us, none of them dramatic, all of them quietly reshaping the picture I had built of him on our wedding day. I watched him help repair a section of the estate's old irrigation system after a storm damaged it, working alongside the groundskeepers with an ease that suggested he had done manual labor many times before, despite his military rank. I watched him sit with my father one evening, listening patiently as my father spoke about the sons he had lost in the war, offering no false comfort, no empty platitudes, only a steady presence that seemed to help my father more than any of the formal condolences he had received from our own people after the fighting ended. I began to understand, slowly and reluctantly, that the empty file I had read on our wedding day was not empty because there was nothing to record. It was empty because someone had decided, deliberately, that whatever Cale Renner had done during the war was not meant to be known by people like me. That understanding became impossible to ignore on the evening a delegation arrived from a neighboring house, distant relations of my mother's family, come to discuss trade agreements that had been disrupted during the war. Among the delegation was an older man named Korvath, a veteran who had served as a liaison officer between our forces and the human fleet during the final campaigns. He recognized Cale the moment he entered the hall, and I watched the color drain from his face. "You," Korvath said, his voice barely above a whisper, all diplomatic formality forgotten. "I know you. I was at Ashkev Reach." The room went silent. My father looked between the two men with confusion. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a sense that whatever was about to be revealed would change everything I thought I understood about the man standing at my side. Cale's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a stillness that reminded me, suddenly and forcefully, of the way Doran had described the stories he had heard, soldiers who held positions no one else could hold. "I was there," Cale said simply. "I do not discuss it." "You do not discuss it," Korvath repeated, something between disbelief and something close to fear coloring his voice. "Do you know what they called you, after the Reach? Do you know what the reports said?" "Korvath," Cale said, and his voice carried a quiet warning that I had never heard from him before, gentle but unmistakably firm. "Not here." Korvath fell silent, though his eyes remained fixed on Cale, with an expression I could not fully interpret, something between awe and unease. The delegation continued their business that evening, but the conversation about trade agreements felt hollow to me now, a formality I could barely focus on, because my mind kept returning to those two words. Ashkev Reach. I had heard the name before, of course. Every citizen of the former empire had heard it. It was the site of one of the final and most devastating engagements of the war, a battle that had effectively ended our capacity to continue fighting and forced the peace negotiations that led, eventually, to my marriage. I had always understood it as a battle, a place where fleets clashed and territories changed hands. I had never imagined that a single name from that battle would follow my husband into my family's hall and cause a grown man, a veteran of the war himself, to go pale with something that looked disturbingly like fear. After the delegation departed for the evening, I found Cale alone on the terrace, looking out at the darkened orchard, the twin moons casting pale light across the grounds. "What happened at Ashkev Reach?" I asked, standing beside him, no longer able to contain the question that had been building in me since Korvath's outburst. He was quiet for a long time before he answered, and when he did, his voice was different than I had ever heard it, quieter, older somehow, carrying a weight that made me suddenly aware of how little I actually knew about the man I had married. "I did what was necessary to keep my people alive," he said, "and in doing so, I became something that frightens people who were there to see it. I am not proud of what happened. I am not ashamed of it either. It simply is what it is, and I would rather not carry it into this house if I can help it. But you cannot help it," I said. "It follows you. I can see that now." He turned to look at me then, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like vulnerability, a crack in the calm composure he had maintained since the day we met. No, he admitted. "It follows me. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that here, with you, it might not need to matter." I did not know what to say to that, standing there in the cool evening air, watching the man I had married out of obligation stare out at the darkness with an expression that suggested he was remembering something he wished he could forget. I felt the last of my certainty about who he was begin to dissolve entirely. That I did not yet understand what he had truly become during the war. I would not understand it fully until the night our own system came under attack, and I watched, with my own eyes, exactly what it meant for a man like Cale Renner to stop holding himself back. That night was closer than either of us knew. The alarm tore through the estate before dawn, a sound I had heard only twice before in my life, both times during the darkest months of the war. I woke to Cale's hand on my shoulder, gentle but urgent, his face illuminated by the red emergency lighting that had activated throughout the house. "Get up," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge I had never heard from him. "We are under attack." I did not question him. I rose immediately, pulling on the first clothes I could find, my heart pounding as the reality of his words settled over me. We had believed, foolishly perhaps, that the peace treaty had ended the danger. We had believed that a defeated house, protected by a marriage tribute to the victors, would be left alone by anyone with sense enough to fear retaliation from the human fleet. We had been wrong. "Raiders," Cale said as we moved quickly through the corridor toward the estate's command room, a small chamber my father had built during the war for emergency communications. "Opportunists from beyond the treaty borders. They believe your house is undefended now that the war has ended. They believe the marriage tribute is symbolic only, a token with no real strength behind it." "Are they wrong?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. Cale did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had changed, taking on a quality I had never heard from him before, something cold and certain that sent a chill through me despite the warmth of the corridor around us. "Yes," he said simply, "they are wrong." We reached the command room to find my father already there, along with Doran and several of the household guards, all of them staring at a display that showed sensor readings from the edge of our system. 3 unregistered vessels had entered our territory, moving on a direct course toward the estate's location, their configuration matching known radar patterns from beyond the treaty's protected borders. "They will reach orbital range within the hour," Doran reported, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. Our defenses were never designed to withstand a coordinated assault. We lost most of our capable ships during the war. My father's face had gone pale, the same expression I remembered from the darkest days of the fighting, when every report brought news of another defeat, another loss, another piece of our empire crumbling away. "We cannot repel 3 vessels," he said quietly. "We barely survived when we had an entire fleet." I felt despair beginning to close around my chest, the same despair I remembered from those final months of the war, the sense that no matter what we did, the outcome had already been decided by forces far beyond our control. Then Cale spoke, and his voice cut through the rising panic in the room like a blade. "I need the crate I brought aboard the estate when I arrived," he said, "the sealed one in the guest wing. Doran, I need every able soldier you have positioned at the outer perimeter within the next 15 minutes. My lord," he said, turning to my father, "I need you and your daughter secured in the deepest part of the estate, with guards you trust completely." "What are you planning?" my father asked. Cale's expression did not change, but something in his eyes had shifted, a stillness settling over him that I recognized now, having seen fragments of it before, in the way the veterans reacted to his presence, in the way Korvath's face had gone pale at the mention of a single name. "I am planning to make sure this house survives the night," he said. "Trust me, or do not, but give me the time I need to do it." I do not know what made me follow him, instead of retreating to safety with my father, but something in his voice, some certainty I had never heard from him before, compelled me to stay close as he moved quickly toward the guest wing, toward the sealed crate that had sat, unopened, in the corner of his sparse quarters since the day he arrived. He knelt beside it, entering a code into a small panel on its surface that I had never noticed before, hidden seamlessly into the crate's design. The lid released with a soft hiss, and I watched as he opened it to reveal equipment unlike anything I had seen in our own military stores, dark and efficient, clearly built for a single purpose. "You kept this hidden," I said, watching him begin methodically preparing the contents. "I did not want to bring it into your home unless I had to," he said, not looking up from his work. "I hoped I would never have to use it here. I am sorry that I do." "Why apologize?" I asked. "If it means we survive tonight, why would you apologize for that?" He paused then, looking up at me, with an expression that held more emotion than I had seen from him since our wedding day. "Because once you see what I am about to do," he said quietly, "you will never look at me the same way again." I have seen that happen before, with people I cared about. I did not want it to happen with you. I did not have time to respond before he was moving again, gathering the equipment with practiced efficiency, his earlier calm replaced by something focused and purposeful that reminded me, uncomfortably, of a predator preparing to hunt. We moved together toward the estate's outer perimeter, where Doran had already gathered the household guards, a small force of perhaps 20 soldiers, most of them veterans with old injuries, none of them equipped for a serious military engagement. Their faces, when they saw Cale approaching in the equipment he had assembled, shifted from fear to something that looked almost like hope, as though his presence alone was enough to change their expectations for the night ahead. "Positions," Cale said, his voice carrying an authority that none of them questioned, despite his lack of formal rank within their command structure. "I want the perimeter held, not advanced. Let them come to us. Do not engage, unless I give the signal." Doran nodded and began relaying the orders, and I watched, still standing beside Cale, despite every instinct telling me to retreat to safety with my father, as the household guards moved into positions around the estate's perimeter, with a renewed sense of purpose that had been entirely absent moments before. Overhead, the sky had begun to lighten with the approach of dawn, and against that lightening sky, I could see the first shapes of the raider vessels descending toward the estate, their engines glowing with the harsh light of atmospheric entry. "You should go to your father," Cale said, not looking at me, his attention fixed entirely on the descending ships. "No," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my own voice. "I want to see this. I want to understand what you truly are." He glanced at me then, something unreadable in his expression, and for a moment I thought he might argue, might insist that I retreat to safety as any reasonable husband would. Instead, he simply nodded once, as though he understood that this moment, whatever it revealed about him, was something I needed to witness for myself. The first vessel touched down at the edge of the estate's grounds, its landing ramp lowering to release a squad of raiders in dark, unmarked armor, weapons raised as they moved toward the house with the confident swagger of soldiers who expected no meaningful resistance. Cale raised a small device to his mouth, and I realized he was intercepting their communications, listening to their coordination as they prepared their assault. What he heard made something shift in his expression, a hardening that I had not seen from him before. "They believe this house is defenseless," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. "They believe the human here is a token, nothing more than a symbol attached to a peace treaty they think means nothing, without an active fleet behind it." "Are they wrong about that too?" I asked, echoing my earlier question from the command room. Cale turned to look at me one final time before the fighting began, and in his eyes I saw something that I had never seen from him before, something ancient and controlled, a certainty that came not from arrogance but from experience, from having done this before and understanding exactly what he was capable of. "They are about to learn exactly how wrong they are," he said. And then the first raider stepped within range of the perimeter, and everything I thought I understood about the quiet, gentle man I had married began to unravel completely. What happened next unfolded so quickly that I struggled, even as I watched it, to fully process what I was seeing. Cale moved before the raiders even realized he was there, closing the distance between the perimeter and the lead squad with a speed that seemed impossible for someone I had watched walk calmly through my family's halls for weeks, someone who had spent his mornings quietly repairing old wooden beams and reading through our ancient texts with careful patience. The man who moved through the dawn light toward the raiders bore no resemblance to that quiet figure. This was someone else entirely, someone whose every movement carried a controlled, purposeful efficiency that spoke of years of experience I could not begin to imagine. The raiders, caught off guard by his approach, scrambled to adjust their formation, their confidence faltering as they realized the defense they had expected to sweep aside was not going to unfold the way they had planned. Cale neutralized the lead elements of their squad with a precision that left me breathless, disabling their weapons and equipment with swift, calculated movements that ended each confrontation before it could properly begin. He was not cruel, I want to be clear about that. He did not linger, did not draw out any confrontation longer than necessary. He simply moved through them like a force of nature that could not be reasoned with or delayed, ending each threat as efficiently as possible before moving to the next. I watched from the perimeter, my hand pressed against my mouth, unable to look away, even as every instinct told me I should retreat to safety. Doran and the household guards held their positions exactly as instructed, providing support at the edges of the engagement, but it became clear within moments that Cale required little assistance from them. He was, quite simply, handling the entire first wave of the assault alone. It was during this initial engagement that I first heard the voices. Cale's communication device, still active from when he had used it to intercept the raiders' coordination, continued to relay their panicked chatter as the assault collapsed around them. At first, the voices carried only confusion, soldiers calling out warnings to each other about the unexpected resistance they had encountered. But as the engagement continued, as more of the raiders began to recognize the man moving through their ranks, the tone of their communication shifted into something else entirely. "That is him," one voice said, static crackling around the words, fear evident even through the distortion. "That is the Ashkev ghost. I have heard the reports. That is him." "Impossible," another voice replied. "The Ashkev ghost is a myth, a story command uses to frighten new recruits." "Look at him," the first voice insisted, panic rising. "Tell me that is not exactly what the survivors described. Tell me that is not the same man." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I listened to this exchange, the same name I had heard from Korvath during the delegation's visit, now being repeated by frightened raiders as they watched my husband move through their assault force with terrifying efficiency. The Ashkev Ghost. It was not a rank, not a formal title, but something that had emerged from the battle itself, whispered among soldiers who had survived encounters with him and could not fully explain what they had witnessed. More voices joined the chatter as the remaining raiders began to fall back from their positions, their confident assault crumbling into disorganized retreat. "He was supposed to be a token," someone said, desperation clear in their voice. "The intelligence said he was a decoration for the peace treaty, nothing more. Command said the humans gave up their real soldiers for the treaty and kept the dangerous ones on active duty. They said this one was harmless." "Command was wrong," another voice snapped back. "Command is always wrong about them. That is why the war ended the way it did." I stood frozen at the perimeter, listening to these fragments of terrified conversation, and I began to understand something I had not fully grasped before that moment. The empty file I had read on our wedding day, the classified service record, the withheld decorations, none of it had been an oversight or an accident. It had been deliberate. A decision made at the highest levels to obscure exactly what kind of soldier had been given to my house as a marriage tribute, perhaps because revealing the truth would have made the treaty itself impossible to negotiate, or perhaps because Cale himself had requested it, wanting to leave behind whatever he had become during the war, rather than carry its full weight into a new life. The second wave of raiders attempted a coordinated strike from a different angle, hoping to catch Cale divided between two fronts. But he anticipated the maneuver before it fully developed, moving with an economy of motion that suggested he had faced this exact tactic many times before. I watched him direct Doran's guards with brief, precise commands, positioning them to cover the approaches he could not personally reach while he handled the more immediate threats himself. Through it all, his expression remained unnervingly calm, none of the controlled fury I might have expected from someone facing an armed assault on his own household. Instead, there was something almost sad in his features, a weariness that suggested this was not something he took any pleasure in, despite his obvious skill at it. "Why does he look like that?" I asked Doran, who had fallen back briefly to redistribute supplies among the perimeter guards. Doran glanced toward Cale before answering, his expression grim. "Because men like him do not enjoy this, my lady. The stories from Ashkev Reach, the ones the survivors told, they all say the same thing. He never wanted to become what he became there. He simply refused to let his people die when he had the ability to stop it. That refusal cost him something, I think, something he has been carrying ever since." I thought of our conversation on the terrace, his admission that what happened at Ashkev Reach was not something he was proud of, nor something he was ashamed of, simply something that was. I began to understand, watching him move through the chaos of the assault with that same weary calm, exactly what he had meant. The raiders' communication grew increasingly desperate as their assault continued to fail, their numbers dwindling as Kale systematically dismantled their coordinated strategy. I heard one voice, clearer than the others, cutting through the static with something approaching despair. "Command needs to know," the voice said. "Tell them the treaty was not a token. Tell them the humans do not give away their weak soldiers. Tell them the Ashkev ghost married into House Koren, and if that is true, if the intelligence was that wrong about one detail, then everything else we were told about the treaty borders might be wrong too." I realized, listening to this, that the raiders had not simply misjudged Kale's individual capability. They had misjudged something much larger, an entire strategic assumption about how the human fleet handled its most capable soldiers after the war ended. And now, watching their assault collapse around them, they were beginning to understand the true cost of that misjudgment. The engagement continued for what felt like hours, but was, according to the estate's automated logs that I reviewed afterward, closer to 40 minutes from the first raider setting foot on our grounds to the final vessel lifting away in a hasty, disorganized retreat. 40 minutes in which I watched the man I had married, the quiet, gentle soul who read our ancient texts and repaired old wooden beams with his own hands, transform into something I had no adequate word for, in either my own language or the trade tongue most species used across the sector. When the last raider vessel finally broke atmosphere and fled our system, its engines burning at maximum capacity in a retreat that abandoned several disabled crew members on the ground, rather than risk further engagement, Kale stood alone at the center of the estate's perimeter, his equipment still active, his breathing steady despite everything he had just done. He looked, in that moment, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. It was something deeper, something that seemed to settle into the lines of his face as the adrenaline of the engagement faded, revealing the weight of whatever memories this night had stirred back to the surface. I approached him slowly, uncertain of what to say, uncertain of how to reconcile the man standing before me with either the quiet husband I had begun to know over the past weeks, or the terrifying figure I had just watched dismantle an entire assault force with methodical, unstoppable precision. "Vesira," he said quietly, using my given name for the first time since our wedding day, his voice carrying none of the coldness I had heard during the engagement. "I am sorry you had to see that." "Do not apologize," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my own voice. "You saved this house. You saved my father. You saved me." "That does not make it easier to watch," he said. "I know what it looks like, seeing someone become something like that. I have seen the way people look at me afterward. I understand if you look at me differently now too." I studied his face in the growing light of morning, taking in the exhaustion, the quiet sorrow, the complete absence of any pride or satisfaction in what he had just accomplished, and I realized that whatever fear I might have expected to feel in this moment had not materialized. Instead, I felt something closer to understanding, a recognition that the man standing before me had not enjoyed a single moment of what had just happened, had done it only because the alternative was allowing harm to come to people he had sworn, through obligation if nothing else, to protect. "I do look at you differently," I admitted, "but perhaps not in the way you fear." He looked at me then with an expression of cautious hope that seemed strangely vulnerable coming from a man who had just single-handedly repelled an armed assault, and I realized that whatever answers I still needed about Ashkev Reach, about the name the raiders had whispered with such fear, about the true history hidden behind his empty service file, I would need to ask him directly, and soon, before the weight of everything left unspoken between us grew too heavy to carry. That conversation would come sooner than either of us expected, and what he told me would change, permanently, the way I understood not just my husband, but the entire war that had brought us together. The peace we found in the aftermath of the raid lasted less than a day. I had barely finished helping tend to the estate's minor damage, working alongside the household staff to clear debris from the outer courtyard, when Doran came rushing toward the main house, his mechanical arm whirring with the urgency of his movement, his face pale with a fear that immediately set my own heart racing. "My lady," he said, breathless, "sensors have detected a much larger vessel entering the system. It is not one of the raider ships from this morning. This is something else entirely, something far more heavily armed. We gathered again in the command room, my father looking even more exhausted than he had during the first crisis. Kale standing at the display with an expression that had shifted from the quiet weariness of the morning into something more focused, more alert. "It is a raider command vessel," he said, studying the readings. "Larger than anything the initial assault force brought with them. They must have called for reinforcements the moment their first attempt failed. Can our defenses withstand something of that size?" My father asked, though the question carried the hollow tone of someone who already suspected the answer. "No," Kale said simply, "not on their own." I felt the familiar despair beginning to rise again, but this time it was accompanied by something else. A strange, unexpected confidence, born from what I had witnessed that morning. If Kale had been capable of repelling an entire assault squad alone, what might he be capable of against a single command vessel, however large it might be? "What do you need from us?" I asked, stepping forward before my father could speak, surprising myself with the directness of the question. Kale looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and then he nodded, as though my question had confirmed something he needed to know. "I need everyone evacuated to the deepest shelter beneath the estate," he said. "And I need you to trust that whatever you see next, whatever it looks like, I am still the same person who has been living in your home these past weeks." "I trust you," I said, and I realized, saying the words aloud, that they were entirely true. The command vessel descended over the estate grounds within the hour, far larger than the ships from the earlier assault, its weapons systems clearly visible even from the ground, capable of leveling the entire estate with a single coordinated strike if its commander chose to use them. Instead, the vessel held position, hovering above the grounds while a voice broadcast across an open channel, demanding the surrender of what remained of House Koren's defenses, and, specifically, the human soldier who had humiliated their forces that morning. I watched from a reinforced observation point deep within the estate's shelter, unable to fully tear myself away despite my promise to remain hidden, as Kale walked alone into the open courtyard to answer the demand. "This is Sergeant Kale Renner," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the open channel. "I am the only defense this house requires. Withdraw your vessel, and no further harm needs to come to your remaining crew." The response was immediate and mocking, the raider commander's voice carrying a confidence that suggested he had not yet processed what had happened to the first wave of his forces. "One soldier does not intimidate a command vessel," the voice replied. "Your fleet abandoned you here, human. Whatever you did to my scouting party this morning, you will not survive what I am about to send against you." What followed was unlike anything I had witnessed that morning, unlike anything I could have imagined possible from a single soldier facing an entire command vessel's deployed forces. The raider commander sent wave after wave of armed troops down to the estate grounds, dozens of soldiers equipped far more heavily than the initial scouting party, clearly intent on overwhelming a single defender through sheer numerical force. Kale did not retreat. He did not hide. He met each wave with a controlled, methodical precision that seemed to grow more efficient with each passing minute, as though the earlier engagement that morning had simply been a warm-up for what he was capable of when truly pressed. I watched him move through the grounds with a speed and coordination that defied everything I understood about the limitations of a single body, disabling equipment, redirecting attacks, moving between positions with an economy of motion that left the raiders constantly one step behind him, unable to establish the coordinated assault they clearly needed to overwhelm him. I heard, through the same intercepted communications that had revealed so much during the morning's engagement, the raider commander's confidence slowly curdling into something approaching panic as wave after wave of his forces failed to make any meaningful progress against a single defender. "How is this possible?" the commander demanded, his voice no longer carrying the mocking confidence from earlier. "He is one soldier. Explain to me how one soldier is doing this." "Because he is not fighting like one soldier anymore, sir," a subordinate voice replied, fear evident even through the communication's static distortion. "Look at the pattern of his movement. He has stopped conserving energy. He has stopped treating this like an engagement he needs to survive. He is treating it like an inevitability he simply needs to see through to its conclusion." I did not fully understand what that meant at the time, watching from the shelter's observation point, but I would come to understand it more fully as the engagement continued. There was a difference, I realized, between a soldier fighting to survive and a soldier who had accepted, somewhere in the deepest part of himself, that survival was not actually in question, that the only question remaining was how efficiently the threat in front of him could be neutralized. Cale had crossed that threshold sometime during the second wave of the assault, and the shift in his approach was unmistakable even to someone with no military training, someone who had spent her entire life in the halls of a noble house rather than on any battlefield. He moved through the raiders' forces with a growing certainty that bordered on inevitability, each engagement ending more quickly than the last as he adapted to their tactics, anticipated their coordination, and systematically dismantled every attempt they made to overwhelm him through numbers alone. It was not cruelty. I need to be clear about that again, because I know how this description might sound to someone who did not witness it themselves. It was something closer to inevitability made manifest, a force of nature that could not be reasoned with or delayed, moving through obstacles with the patient, unstoppable certainty of a river, carving through stone. The raider commander, watching his forces fail wave after wave, finally made the decision to descend from his vessel personally, bringing with him what remained of his most heavily armed guard, clearly hoping that a concentrated strike from his best remaining soldiers might succeed where the scattered waves had failed. This final confrontation lasted only minutes, though it felt, to those of us watching from the shelter, like it stretched far longer than that. Kael met the commander's elite guard with the same methodical precision he had shown throughout the entire engagement, but there was something different in this final exchange, something that made even Doran, standing beside me in the shelter with decades of combat experience behind him, go quiet with something approaching reverence. "He is not just defending the house anymore," Doran said quietly, almost to himself. "He is making a statement. He wants every raider who survives this to carry the story back to whoever sent them. He wants this to be the last time anyone underestimates what this house means." When the confrontation finally ended, the raider commander's remaining forces retreated to their vessel in a hasty, disorganized withdrawal that mirrored the earlier scouting party's flight, abandoning any pretense of an organized retreat in their haste to escape the grounds. The command vessel lifted away from our system within minutes, its engines burning at maximum output, and the open channel that had carried the raider commander's earlier mocking confidence fell silent entirely. I emerged from the shelter alongside my father and the household staff to find Cale standing alone in the courtyard once more, his equipment powered down, his posture carrying an exhaustion that seemed to reach all the way to his bones. But there was something else in his expression as well, something I had not seen from him before, a quiet, weary acceptance of what he had just done, as though he had made peace, somewhere during the engagement, with the fact that this was simply who he was, whatever cost that identity carried. "Is it over?" my father asked, his voice trembling slightly as he surveyed the damage scattered across the once pristine courtyard. "For tonight," Cale said. "But word will spread, my lord. Word always spreads. Whoever sent that command vessel will know, by morning, exactly what happened here, and exactly what protects this house now." I walked toward him slowly, studying his face in the fading evening light, searching for any sign of the quiet, gentle man I had come to know over the past weeks, beneath the exhausted warrior standing before me now. I found him there, buried beneath the weariness, still present despite everything the day had demanded of him. "You did not enjoy any of that," I said, and it was not a question. "No," he said simply, "I never do. But I would do it again, without hesitation, if it meant keeping you and your family safe." I reached out and took his hand, the same gesture that had felt so foreign and unwelcome on our wedding day, and found that it no longer carried any of that same reluctance. His hand was warm, just as it had been that first day, though now it also carried the faint tremor of exhaustion, the physical cost of everything he had just endured on our behalf. "Come inside," I said quietly. "You have done enough for one day. Let us take care of you now." He looked at me with an expression of quiet surprise, as though the offer itself was unexpected, and then he nodded, allowing me to lead him back toward the house, leaving behind the courtyard that had witnessed, over the course of a single day, the complete unraveling of everything I thought I understood about the man I had married out of nothing more than cold, political obligation. The following days brought a change to the estate that I could feel in every corridor, every conversation, every glance exchanged between the staff who had, until recently, treated Cale with polite but distant courtesy. Now they looked at him the way Doran's veterans had looked at him from the very beginning, with something between reverence and quiet awe, a recognition that the quiet man who repaired old wooden beams and read our ancient texts with careful patience was also the same man who had single-handedly repelled 2 separate assaults on our home within the span of a single day. The story had already begun to spread beyond our estate, carried by the delegation members who had witnessed Korvath's reaction, by the household staff who spoke to relatives in neighboring houses, by the surviving raiders themselves, who had, according to reports reaching us through Doran's old military contacts, carried word of the engagement back to whoever had sent them. House Koren was no longer simply a defeated noble family surviving on the charity of a peace treaty. It was, in the span of a single terrifying day, transformed into something else entirely, a house protected by a name that raiders whispered with genuine fear, a name I still did not fully understand, despite everything I had witnessed. I found Cale on the 3rd morning after the engagement, sitting alone in the estate's small library, where I had first discovered him studying our ancient texts, his expression distant, lost in thoughts I could not fully read. "I want you to tell me about Ashkef Reach," I said, sitting down across from him with a determination I had not felt since our wedding day. All of it, not the version the reports gave, not the version the raiders whispered in fear. I want to understand what actually happened there, and what it cost you. He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face as though weighing whether I truly wanted to hear the answer, or whether I was asking out of the same curiosity that had driven Korvath's questions and the household staff's whispered speculation. Ashkevif Reach was the final major engagement of the war, he said finally, his voice carrying a weight I had not heard from him before. My unit was assigned to hold a defensive position that protected a civilian evacuation route. We were told we would have reinforcements within 6 hours. The reinforcements did not arrive for 3 days. 3 days, I repeated, unable to fully process what that meant. 3 days holding a position against forces that outnumbered us by a margin I still do not like to think about, he continued. My unit was reduced from 40 soldiers to 6 by the end of the first day. By the end of the second day, it was just me. I made a choice, on that second night, that I have never fully explained to anyone, not even my own command afterward. I decided that I was not going to let that evacuation route fall, regardless of what it cost me personally to hold it. What did it cost you? I asked quietly. He looked down at his hands, turning them over slowly, as though examining them for evidence of something only he could see. I do not fully know how to explain it in a way that makes sense, he said. I stopped thinking about surviving the engagement. I stopped thinking about myself entirely. I became something narrower, something focused entirely on the single task in front of me, holding that position no matter what it required. When the reinforcements finally arrived on the 3rd day, they found me still standing, still holding the line, and they told me afterward that what they saw was something they had no adequate way to describe in their reports. That is why my file remained empty. Command decided that whatever happened to me during those 3 days was not something that should follow me, not in official records, not in casual conversation. They gave me the choice to carry a classified designation rather than a public one, and I took it, hoping I could leave what happened at Ashkev Reach behind me entirely. But you cannot leave it behind, I said. It followed you here. It followed you into this house. Yes, he admitted. It seems that whatever I became during those 3 days does not simply disappear because I want it to. It is part of me now, whether I acknowledge it or not, and every time circumstances demand it, that part of me answers the call, regardless of how much I might wish it would stay quiet. I studied his face, seeing for the first time the full weight of what he had carried since our wedding day, a burden he had tried to set aside quietly, without drawing attention to it, hoping that a new life in a new home might allow him some measure of peace from what the war had made him into. "I do not fear you," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my own voice. "I want you to know that. Whatever happened at Ashkev Reach, whatever the raiders whisper about you, whatever name they use to describe what they witnessed, none of it changes what I have seen with my own eyes these past weeks. I have watched you treat every person in this house with kindness. I have watched you work alongside the staff without complaint. I have watched you sit with my father and offer him comfort no one else could provide. That is who you are to me, Kale. Not a weapon, not a myth the raiders whisper in fear. A man who chose, both at Ashkev Reach and here, to protect people who could not protect themselves, regardless of what it cost him." Something shifted in his expression then, a vulnerability I had never seen from him before, and for a moment I thought I saw something close to tears gathering in his eyes, before he blinked them away. "I did not expect to find that kind of understanding here," he said quietly. "When I received this assignment, I expected resentment, perhaps hostility, certainly not the kind of patience you have shown me these past weeks. I did not expect to find someone who could look past what I am capable of and still see the person underneath it. Perhaps that is because the person underneath it is the one who matters most," I said. "The rest is simply what circumstances have demanded of you. It does not define who you choose to be when circumstances are not demanding anything at all." He reached across the table and took my hand, the same gesture I had offered him in the courtyard after the engagement, and this time I understood that the gesture carried something more than simple gratitude. There was a genuine warmth in it, a connection that had grown slowly and quietly over the weeks since our forced marriage, built not from the political obligation that had brought us together, but from something far more personal, something neither of us had expected to find in a union neither of us had chosen for ourselves. "I did not marry you because I wanted to," I said softly, "but I find myself, now, glad that circumstances brought us together regardless. I do not know what that means for us going forward, but I know that I no longer think of this marriage as an obligation. I am simply enduring." "What do you think of it as now?" he asked, his voice carrying a quiet hope that mirrored the uncertainty I felt in my own chest. "I think of it as the beginning of something I did not expect to find," I said. "Something I am not yet ready to name, but something I no longer wish to run from." We sat together in the quiet library for a long time after that, the weight of everything we had shared settling into a comfortable silence between us, and I realized, watching the morning light shift slowly across the room, that whatever the galaxy chose to call Kale Renner, whatever fear his name carried among raiders and enemies, who had learned to whisper it with dread, I had found something entirely different beneath that reputation. I had found a partner, however unexpected, however unlikely the circumstances that brought us together, and I was no longer willing to let the fear others felt toward him define the way I understood the man I had come to know. The galaxy could call him whatever it wished. I knew, now, exactly who he truly was. Word of what happened at House Koren spread across the sector faster than I could have anticipated, carried through channels both official and informal, until it became a story told in trading posts and diplomatic halls alike, a story that transformed the way neighboring houses viewed my family entirely. Within a month, the delegations that arrived at our estate carried a different tone than the cautious, pitying visits we had grown accustomed to since the war's end. Houses that had barely acknowledged our existence during the difficult months following our defeat now sought audiences with my father, hoping to establish trade agreements and alliances with a house that had, seemingly overnight, become one of the most secure territories in the region. No raider force, word had spread, would dare test the defenses of a house protected by the soldier the enemy called the Ashkev Ghost, the same soldier who had single-handedly repelled a coordinated assault force and its accompanying command vessel without requiring any support from the wider human fleet. I watched my father's demeanor shift over those following weeks, the quiet grief that had settled over him since the war's end, slowly giving way to something resembling his old confidence. The pride he had carried before our empire's defeat began reshaping itself around this new reality, one where House Koren was no longer simply surviving on the mercy of a peace treaty, but thriving under the protection of a man the galaxy had learned to fear and respect in equal measure. Korvath returned to our estate several weeks after the engagement, this time with none of the fear that had colored his earlier reaction to Kale's presence. Instead, he approached with a formal request that surprised us both. House Koren's position has changed significantly, he said, addressing my father with a new deference in his tone. Several neighboring houses have asked me to inquire whether an alliance might be possible, one that would benefit from the security your household now provides. My father glanced at me, and I saw in his expression a question he was silently asking, wondering whether I would object to our family's newfound reputation being built, at least in part, on Kale's willingness to continue serving as our protector in whatever capacity circumstances required. That decision belongs to my husband as much as it belongs to this house, I said, surprising Korvath with the directness of my response. He has already given more to this family than any tribute the treaty required of him. Any further arrangement should be made with his full agreement, not simply assumed because of what he demonstrated during the raid. Kale, standing quietly at the edge of the room during this exchange, offered a small, grateful nod in my direction before addressing Korvath directly. I am willing to discuss what protection this house might reasonably offer to allied territories, he said, but I want it understood that I am not a weapon to be deployed at the convenience of every house seeking security through association with House Koren. What I did during the raid, I will consider extending that protection to genuine allies, but only on terms that respect the choice involved, not the assumption that my capabilities exist to be claimed by anyone clever enough to seek an alliance. Korvath nodded, some of his earlier fear returning briefly before settling into something more like respect. Understood, he said. I will relay that to the interested parties. After Korvath departed, I found myself standing beside Kale on the same terrace where we had first spoken honestly about Ashkev Reach, watching the twin suns begin their descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the orchard that had witnessed so much change since our wedding day. Do you regret what happened? I asked. The way this house's reputation has grown around what you did that day, the way people now see you as something more than the quiet man who repairs old wooden beams and reads ancient texts in the library. He considered the question carefully before answering, his gaze fixed on the horizon. I do not regret protecting this family, he said. I never will regret that, regardless of what it revealed about me or how it changed the way people perceive this house. But I would be lying if I said I did not miss the anonymity I had before that day, the simple life of repairing beams and reading texts, unburdened by reputation or expectation. Perhaps you can have both, I said. The reputation exists now, whether either of us wishes it or not. But that does not mean you have to let it define every moment of your life here. You can still repair beams, you can still read texts in the library, you can still be the quiet man I fell in love with during those first weeks, even if the galaxy now also knows you as something else entirely. He turned to look at me then, something warm and grateful in his expression. Fell in love with, he repeated softly. Is that truly what happened? Somewhere between the wedding neither of us wanted and the raid that revealed everything I tried to hide. I felt a warmth rise in my own chest, an honesty I had been building toward for weeks finally finding its voice. Yes, I said simply. Somewhere in all of that, despite everything, despite the fear and the uncertainty and the reputation that now follows you across the sector, I fell in love with the man underneath all of it. The one who apologized on our wedding night for how difficult things would be. The one who offered me space I did not know I needed. The one who sat with my father and helped him grieve in ways no formal condolence ever could. That is the man I married, Kale, regardless of what name the raiders whisper in fear. He reached for my hand, and this time there was no hesitation in the gesture, no political obligation weighing down the connection between us, only genuine warmth and a future neither of us had expected to find when the treaty first bound us together. I love you too, he said quietly. I did not expect to find this here, in a marriage built from obligation rather than choice, but I am grateful, every day, that circumstances brought me to this house, to this family, to you. The sun continued its descent behind us as we stood together on that terrace, and I thought about everything that had changed since the day I stood in my family's ceremonial hall, resentful and afraid, watching a quiet human soldier walk toward me with steady, even steps. I thought about the empty file that had told me nothing about who he truly was, about the whispered name that raiders used to describe something they clearly still did not fully understand. The galaxy had learned to fear my husband, to whisper his name as a warning across trade routes and diplomatic channels, to treat House Koren with a new respect born from what he had demonstrated during a single, terrifying day of conflict. But I had learned something else entirely, something the galaxy's fear could never fully capture. I had learned that the man behind the reputation, the quiet soul who had walked into my life through nothing more than political obligation, was worth loving not because of what he could do in defense of the people he cared about, but because of who he chose to be in every quiet moment when circumstances demanded nothing of him at all. They called him a ghost, a nightmare, a name whispered with dread across a dozen systems that had learned, the hard way, not to underestimate what a single determined soldier could accomplish when everything he cared about was threatened. I called him something else entirely. I called him my husband, and for the first time since that cold ceremony in my family's ancient hall, I understood that the title carried no obligation at all, only a choice I would gladly make again, regardless of everything the galaxy believed it knew about the man I had come to love.